A husband sold his sick wife and their house, and years later something shocking happened. When Dulcie was little, she always brought animals home: stray cats, injured birds, and abandoned dogs. Her grandmother Carmen, who took care of her after her mother's death, often said, "Dulcie, today you bring a cat, tomorrow a dog, and then what, maybe a lost child? Or you'll fall in love with some homeless guy. Your kindness can get you into trouble." Dulcie truly was a girl with a big heart. Maybe because she only had her grandmother, she felt the need to take care of others. After school, it was no surprise to anyone that she chose to study nursing. She wanted to help people, and so she did. After graduating with honors, she found a job at a clinic in the city. Although the challenge was the daily commute from the village, Dulcie adapted to her new life. Her grandmother was relieved to see that her granddaughter had a promising future ahead of her. Dulcie felt fulfilled at work. The days always seemed the same, but she always found joy in the little things, like talking to patients. One cold October night, while returning from work, Dulcie noticed a boy at the bus stop. He was swinging his legs and looking around with a sad look. Dulcie felt something was wrong. The boy looked tearful and had no appropriate clothes for the cold. She approached carefully. "Hi, little one, are you okay?" Dulcie asked. The boy looked at her warily. Dulcie thought quickly and pulled a chocolate bar from her purse, a gift from a grateful patient. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to us. Also, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We're asking this because, this chocolate is really delicious. I could eat it right now, but how about we share it, she suggested, trying to break the ice. The boy looked at the chocolate and after a while shyly stretched out his hand to take it. While little Pedro devoured the chocolate, Dulcie watched him with a caring look. The boy clearly needed more than just sweets. He needed a good meal, a bath, and who knows, maybe a new hairstyle. After eating the chocolate, the boy's eyes sparkled, and he asked hopefully, "Is there more?" Dulcie smiled sadly. "I'm sorry, but that was the only one. But tell me, what's your name?" she asked. "Pedro," the boy replied shyly. "How old are you, Pedro?" "6. I'll go to school next year." He paused, then added, "But Uncle Leon says stupid kids like me can't go to school." Dulcie felt her heart tighten. "Who is Uncle Leon?" she asked. "He's my mother's husband. He always calls me stupid." Pedro lowered his head, his eyes seeming to be on the verge of tears. "What does your mother say?" He sighed deeply. "My mom is in heaven along with my grandma, grandpa, and Elsa." Dulcie tilted her head in confusion. "Elsa was our female dog. One day she disappeared after Uncle Leon took her somewhere. He said he gave her back to her old owner or something, but I think she went to heaven too." Dulcie's heart tightened even more. "Text here. Text here. There we have cake, tea, a dog, and 3 cats. What do you think?" Dulcie suggested, trying to sound cheerful. The boy seemed undecided. "When my mother was alive, she always told me not to go with strangers." Dulcie crouched down to be at eye level with him. "I understand your concerns, but I'm not a stranger. I am a nurse and my mission is to help people. Now I want to help you. Come with me, please." Pedro shuddered. "What if Uncle Leon gets angry? He beats me." Dulcie felt a wave of indignation. "This has to end. Come with me." At that moment, the bus arrived at the stop. Without thinking twice, Dulcie took Pedro's hand and walked inside. As the bus began to move, the boy approached the window. Dulcie watched him anxiously, afraid he would start screaming or panicking. However, Pedro just looked outside in silence as the bus took them to the village. Carmen wasn't too happy when she found out about the situation, but she tried not to show it. She took care of the boy, fed him, and then went to a neighbor who had children to ask for clean clothes for Pedro. After a while, she found some appropriate clothes, bathed the boy, dressed him, and let him watch cartoons while she and Dulcie talked about the situation. "Are you suggesting this is child kidnapping? That we take other people's children?" Grandma asked. "You know very well what you should do. Report it to the police?" Dulce replied, "I can't do it. Tomorrow I will talk to Ms. Yolanda, our medical director. I'm sure she will be able to advise us, and so the topic is closed for now." That night, Dulcie shared her situation with Dr. Yolanda, whom she fully trusted. Dr. Yolanda was an exceptional employee, talented, and a natural leader. "He has signs of being beaten," the doctor said. "We need to report this to the police." "Miss Yolanda, how could I hand him over to the police? He would be taken to an orphanage, and I wouldn't be able to get him out." Dulcie expressed concern. "Don't worry, Dulcie. I have contacts in the police and also in child protection. We won't break the law. We will just find a solution to this situation so that you won't become guilty if his stepfather decides to accuse you. You could be charged with kidnapping." Dr. Yolanda said, For Dulcie, a real bureaucratic maze began, full of explanations, documents, and a whole mess of paperwork. Fortunately, she found understanding in Child Protective Services. They promised her help, and even social activists offered support by publishing her story in newspapers. It was an extremely difficult period in Dulcie's life, but thanks to the efforts of people with big hearts, she finally managed to become Pedro's legal guardian. It was one of the happiest days she had experienced during this turbulent period. Young Dulce built a deep bond with the boy, and he also saw her as an important person in his life. Even Grandma Carmen treated Pedro like her own grandson, surrounding him with love and care. Meanwhile, the boy's stepfather, initially trapped in alcoholism, did not understand the situation. When he finally sobered up and realized that Pedro was not home, a few days later, he was overcome with panic. He was afraid that his friends had done something to the boy. Fear kept him from seeking help from the police. He wasn't honestly worried about the boy, just what might happen to him, so he decided to disappear. Dulce devoted herself intensely to comforting and caring for a homeless boy. Her heart was filled with kindness. Over time, this love and care began to change the boy's life. Over time, Pedro became the most radiant child in the world. Although his family was not rich and they lived modestly, the boy found satisfaction in simple things. They regularly visited his mother and grandparents at the cemetery. Dulce tried to get a photo of Pedro's mother because his stepfather destroyed everything during one of his drinking episodes. She had to search among friends and distant relatives who might still have something connected with the boy's mother. When she finally gave Pedro the photo album, the boy beamed with joy. The boy was a true animal lover. He cared for Dulce's cats and loved playing with dogs, especially on warm summer days. These interactions with animals made Pedro's eyes sparkle. Dulce accompanied Pedro to school. He was always well-dressed and had a modern hairstyle. Dulce made sure everything was perfect. Her attention to detail was remarkable, and it was even reflected in the boy's appearance. Pedro did well in his studies, especially considering that there were few children in the small village. This allowed the teacher to focus on each child individually, giving them special attention. Every day was filled with a true sense of belonging. Dulce appreciated this new responsibility. Sometimes she laughed at her grandmother's prediction that had somehow come true. Grandma predicted that Dulce would bring home a baby, and she did. However, at that moment, young Dulce had no idea that another prophecy would soon come true. One ordinary day at the hospital where Dulce worked, a young man named Hugo arrived with a wound on his face. He was noticeably handsome, but his skin was red and irritated and his voice was hoarse, indicating deep pain. The wounds that brought Hugo to the hospital were the result of a fight. At first, the new patient did not arouse any special feelings in Dulce. She cared for him, performing dressings as she did with other patients and conversing politely as she did with everyone else in the ward. Hugo received several stitches in his face and recovered over time. After a few days, he decided to visit Dulce during his lunch break as a token of gratitude. He didn't seem to have any second intentions. But one day, Hugo took Dulce's hand and said simply, "I can't stop looking at you, Dulce. No matter how hard I try, I can't help but feel nervous when I see you. It's like you're my only thing to admire." These words confused the nurse. Patients had expressed sympathy for her before, but never like this. Dulce tried to let go of his hand, but Hugo held her tightly, making it clear that he wouldn't give up that easily. Her heart began to beat faster at the confidence and strength he exuded. Gradually, Dulce realized that Hugo always appeared alone and seemed to always wear the same clothes. He always came at times when most people were at work and had no photos on social media. He explained that he did not communicate with his parents and had no loyal friends. His life seemed complicated, being a loner with unique visions and opinions on life that were different from most people. Dulce was very attracted to Hugo's attitude, as if he was a lone wolf standing out from the rest of the pack. Hugo expressed his feelings by giving Dulce something luxurious, a bracelet. He then invited her out for coffee, beginning a passionate relationship between them. Previously, Dulce had relationships with guys, but nothing serious came of it. She often wanted to have a family and children, but many of her partners were not ready for such commitments. Yes, it's true, but it's a forced situation. The problem is not me, but the environment. There are few women who possess the qualities I value. I've been looking for that one person for a long time and I haven't found him yet, but if I find him, I will never let him go," Hugo replied. So the relationship between Dulce and Hugo began to develop amidst different visions of life and values that, although different, seemed to find a strange balance between them. Dulcie was enchanted every time Hugo expressed his adoration for her, melting like ice under his warm words. She felt her heart beat faster and her legs tremble with each subtle invitation. Dulcie soon invited Hugo to stay at her house, claiming that it would be dangerous to return to the village at night, even though she had already done so many times. The excuse was quite strange. Dulcie just wanted to spend more time with Hugo. Surprisingly, he accepted it without much question and spent the night like that. However, the next day, he showed no intention of leaving. "It's so good here, I feel at home." Text here. "Grandma Carmen is very hospitable," Hugo said, comforting and caressing the old woman's arms. "Visiting is fine, but home is even better, right?" Grandma replied, dropping a hint. Hugo seemed to ignore these suggestions, visiting Dulcie every week and staying for a few days. He felt so comfortable in this house that he decided to stay permanently. However, Grandma Carmen was very annoyed when Hugo showed up with the things. She was categorical. "Only if you marry Dulcie, then you can move in here, but for now, leave." The old lady was very outraged by the behavior of the guest, who also did not get along with Pedro. From the very beginning, Hugo had a little misunderstanding with poor Pedro, even though Dulcie shared the boy's difficult story with him. Dulcie also did not appreciate Hugo's attitude towards her ward, but she attributed this to Hugo's lack of skill in dealing with children. "Don't worry, they will both get used to each other, and everything will be fine," Dulcie thought, believing that Hugo loved her and would do anything to make her happy. When Hugo finally asked Dulcie to marry him, she agreed without hesitation, and they soon became husband and wife. However, Pedro was very unhappy that he had to share Dulcie's attention with someone like Hugo, and Grandma also did not get along with the new member of the family. 2 weeks after his grandmother's funeral, Carmen Dulce noticed a bruise on Pedro's cheek. He said he had been fighting at school during recess due to a disagreement with one of his classmates, which worried Dulce, who promised to take strict action against the aggressor. However, during the investigation to discover who was guilty, Pedro admitted that he was attacked by Isabella, Dulce's close friend. Surprised and shocked, Dulce listened to the boy's story. According to Pedro, the aggression occurred after Aunt Isabella's visit. Pedro poured water on Isabella's shoes, although he claimed he wanted to wash them. In fact, he acted maliciously, leaving Isabella with wet shoes, which made her very angry, and she responded with a strong punch. 2 weeks after his grandmother's funeral, Carmen Dulce noticed a bruise on Pedro's cheek. He said he had been fighting at school during recess due to a disagreement with one of his classmates, which worried Dulce, who promised to take strict action against the aggressor. However, during the investigation to discover who was guilty, Pedro admitted that he was attacked by Isabella, Dulce's close friend. Surprised and shocked, Dulce listened to the boy's story. According to Pedro, the aggression occurred after Aunt Isabella's visit. Pedro poured water on Isabella's shoes, although he claimed he wanted to wash them. In fact, he acted maliciously, leaving Isabella with wet shoes, which made her very angry, and she responded with a strong punch. Dulce could barely believe what she was hearing. She and Isabella were once friends at school, although they went their separate ways. While Dulce focused on her studies, Isabella was involved in other things. However, Dulce could not accept her former friend's aggressive behavior towards Pedro. The strangest thing was that Isabella visited the house while Dulce was away, which caused internal conflict in Dulce. After all, Hugo was her husband, someone who paid her affectionate words and claimed loyalty, declaring that Dulce was the only woman he was interested in. Lost in the pain, Dulce didn't notice when the car came around the corner. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Screeching tires, violent impact, screams, and then a strange feeling of lightness. Dulce felt a sharp pain in her chest. She tried to breathe, but something was pressing down heavily on her, blocking her lungs. This is the end, Dulce thought, closing her eyes. When she regained consciousness, she found herself in a hospital room, now a patient rather than a nurse. Lucia, a kind nurse who had recently graduated, held her hand and expressed sympathy on her pale face. Lost in the pain, Dulce didn't notice when the car came around the corner. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Screeching tires, violent impact, screams, and then a strange feeling of lightness. Dulce felt a sharp pain in her chest. She tried to breathe, but something was pressing down heavily on her, blocking her lungs. This is the end, Dulce thought, closing her eyes. When she regained consciousness, she found herself in a hospital room, now a patient rather than a nurse. Lucia, A kind nurse who had recently graduated held her hand and expressed sympathy on her pale face. "Can you hear me?" Lucia said with emotion. "Yes, Lucia, I hear you." And the next day he showed no intention of leaving. "It's so good here. I feel like at home." "Grandma Carmen is very hospitable," Hugo said, feeling comfortable and stroking the old woman's hunched shoulder. "Visiting is fine, but living at home is even better, right?" Grandma replied, throwing subtle allusions. Hugo seemed to ignore these insinuations, visiting Dulcie every week and staying for a few days. He felt so comfortable in this house that he decided to stay permanently. However, Grandma Carmen became very annoyed when Hugo showed up with his things. She was categorical. "Only if you marry Dulcie can you move here, but for now leave." The old woman was outraged by the behavior of the guest, who also did not get along with Pedro. From the beginning, Hugo had minor arguments with poor Pedro, even though Dulcie told him the boy's difficult story. Dulcie also didn't appreciate Hugo's attitude towards her ward, but she attributed it to his lack of skill in dealing with children. "Don't worry, they will both get used to each other and everything will be fine," Dulcie mused, believing that Hugo loved her and would do anything to make her happy. When Hugo finally asked Dulcie to marry him, she accepted without hesitation, and they soon became husband and wife. However, Pedro was very unhappy about having to share Dulcie's attention with someone like Hugo, and Grandma also didn't get along with the new addition to the family. "This Hugo is not trustworthy," said the old woman. Despite her doubts about Hugo, Dulcie loved him and believed that he would finally show his true nature. When Carmen became ill and sadly passed away, the sudden death of Carmen's grandmother was a huge shock to Dulcie. Although she was often ill, no one expected her to end so quickly. After the death of his grandmother Carmen, Hugo began to feel like the owner of the house, and his behavior began to exceed all limits. 2 weeks after Grandma Carmen's funeral, Dulcie noticed a bruise on Pedro's cheek. He said that he had fought at school during break with one of his friends, which worried Dulcie, who promised to take strict measures against the aggressor. However, after being investigated to discover who was to blame, Pedro admitted that he had been beaten by Isabelle, Dulcie's close friend. Surprised and shocked, Dulce listened to the boy's story. However, Dulcie could not accept her former friend's aggressive behavior towards Pedro. The strangest thing was that Isabelle visited the house while Dulce was away, which caused internal conflict within Dulce. After all, Hugo was her husband, someone who spoke words of endearment and claimed that Dulce was the only woman he was interested in. The discrepancy between the image Hugo projected and his actions created deep confusion in Dulce's mind. She hired a private detective who confirmed that Isabelle and Hugo were having an affair, meeting regularly while Dulce was away. Under the weight of Hugo's suffering and betrayal, Dulce experienced unimaginable pain and a sense of emptiness that consumed her. However, Dulce could not accept her former friend's aggressive behavior towards Pedro. The strangest thing was that Isabelle visited the house while Dulce was away, which caused internal conflict within Dulce. After all, Hugo was her husband, someone who spoke words of endearment and claimed that Dulce was the only woman he was interested in. The discrepancy between the image Hugo projected and his actions created deep confusion in Dulce's mind. She hired a private detective who confirmed that Isabelle and Hugo were having an affair, meeting regularly while Dulce was away. Under the weight of Hugo's suffering and betrayal, Dulce experienced unimaginable pain and a sense of emptiness that consumed her. Her husband's brazen change in behavior left her devastated, especially when he began coming home drunk, often hurling cruel words at Pedro and Dulce, criticizing them mercilessly. News of his relationship with Isabelle quickly spread throughout the area, which made the situation even worse. But one day, at the end of her day at the hospital, preparing to go home, Dulce couldn't help but ask a painful question. How could he do this to me? She kept her suffering hidden all day, not showing it to patients and colleagues, but when she walked through the hospital doors, she began to cry uncontrollably, like a helpless child for whom only pain existed. At that moment, Dulce barely noticed the car come around the corner. Everything happened in the blink of an eye: screeching tires, a violent crash, screaming, and then a strange feeling of lightness. Dulce felt a sharp, crushing pain in her chest. "Don't worry, Dulce, you're recovering. Everything will be back to normal soon. I'm so happy you're alive. It's amazing that you are here. The driver fled, of course, but luckily someone saw you and called an ambulance," Lucia said. Dulce felt confused. Text here. Text here. Text here. He rejected Dulcie and only worried about how unfair life was for him. For him, Dulcie's death would mean continuing his life without major worries in a house that would be his own. In the hospital, Hugo visited Dulcie only once, arguing that he did not have time to care for Pedro and keep the house in order at the same time. Dulcie felt disappointed to realize that Hugo had done practically nothing all day except make excuses. When she returned home, she found a terrifying reality. Pedro was dirty, hungry, and hadn't gone to school for over a month. The cats that previously lived with them ran away in search of a better life, but sometimes they returned. The cats were free while the dog remained chained and poorly fed at the end of the yard. Pedro did what he could to care for the unhappy dog, often sharing his own food with him. Dulcie saw all this, but lying in bed without outside help, she could not even sit in the wheelchair that had been given to her at the request of the hospital director. Hugo became increasingly neglectful, ignoring not only the needs of Pedro and the animals, but also Dulce. He did not contribute to basic care, forcing Pedro to take on this role, bringing food from the fridge, reading for her, and being her only support. The situation reached a breaking point when Hugo attacked Pedro, accusing him of stealing sausages from the fridge. Distraught, Pedro turned for help to his neighbor Elena, a brave woman who often received clothes from Dulcie's late grandmother, Carmen. Elena, who has a strong personality, confronted Hugo, threatening to call the police if he hurt the boy again. Elena then went to Dulcie's room and was horrified to see the young woman's condition. Sympathetically, she said, "Dulce, what did he do to you?" Immediately, Elena took control of the situation, bathed Dulcie, fed her, and helped Pedro by sending him to school. She began visiting Dulcie's home twice a day, tending to the family's basic needs before work in the morning and then in the afternoon. Helena helped Dulcie tirelessly, taking care of her daily needs. Hugo's bold behavior in engaging with Isabelle enraged Elena, who spared no words in expressing her outrage. Dulcie, distraught by what had happened, cried bitterly, covering her face with her hands. "Poor thing," Elena pointed out, "but don't worry, I'm here. Everything will be fine." However, Hugo, frustrated by Elena's intervention and knowing that it would not be easy to get rid of her, went to extreme measures. One day, while Elena was at work, Hugo showed up at Dulcie's house with a man in a suit. He excitedly said, "My flower, this is a lawyer. He came to help us sort out the ownership issue." Dulcie was surprised. "Property issues between us?" she asked, confused. "Exactly. And now that you're here, we can set each other free." "Let me go and live happily," Hugo said, making Dulcie feel dazed. Dulce was in shock, almost choking. "Are you crazy? I would give you the house. What would we have then? Pedro and I would be treated as disabled by the state, and he, as a child, would be sent to an orphanage. I've already organized everything. In fact, I should have done it earlier." "You will live in a home for the disabled," Hugo explained. "No, that won't happen," Dulcie shouted. "Get out of my sight, never to be seen again, neither you nor your lawyer." "Get out now!" Hugo stepped closer, whispering threats in Dulcie's ear. "Think, Dulcie, think. Let me go or something irreversible will happen. There are many dangers for a child in this house. Boiling water may spill on the stove. Electricity may shock him from an exposed wire. He may get lost in the forest or in a swamp," he insinuated, trying to arouse fear and emotional pressure in Dulcie. Dulcie screamed in fear and hatred as she confronted Hugo. "Get out now!" Hugo stepped closer, whispering threats in Dulcie's ear. "Think, Dulcie, think. Let me go, or something irreversible will happen. There are many dangers for a child in this house. Boiling water may spill on the stove. Electricity may shock him from an exposed wire. He may get lost in the forest or in a swamp," he insinuated, trying to arouse fear and emotional pressure in Dulcie. Dulcie screamed in fear and hatred as she confronted Hugo. She had experienced disappointments with this man, but she couldn't imagine the lengths to which he would go. She signed all the documents without exception, but was paralyzed when Hugo took Pedro out of the house as planned. That morning, after he had arranged everything, Dulcie cried desperately, trying to help Pedro, screaming, but Hugo pushed her away and sent her away. The pain of losing Pedro left Dulcie in a deep depression. She didn't want to eat, drink, or do anything. Her only desire was to leave this world. The situation became unbearable for Dulcie, who found herself in a whirlwind of despair and suffering without the strength to overcome the loss of Pedro and the betrayal of Hugo. She saw her efforts, hopes, and dreams destroyed, leading her to a state of complete despair. Dulcie was deeply depressed when Hugo brought a guest home. The young man, a little older than Dulcie, had a pleasant face and confident movements, but there was something about his face that hinted at a difficult time in his life. Dulcie, absorbed in her sadness, felt empathy for the guest. However, this fondness disappeared immediately when she discovered the reason for Hugo's visit. He sold the house. Not only did he sell the house, he sold it with Dulcie. The buyer, named Roberto, had limited funds, and Hugo offered him a price well below market value. Roberto, newly divorced and wanting to escape the city, was initially hesitant to buy a house with someone living in it. However, Hugo convinced him that Dulcie's life was coming to an end, and soon no one would bother her. Hugo didn't even make sure that Dulcie was moved to a home for the disabled. It was just a bluff. My friend, you want to put her in a nursing home, but that is inhumane. Let her live here for the rest of her life. Besides, when will you get a house like this for such a low price? Hugo argued. Roberto ultimately accepted the offer. Dulce was stunned by this revelation. The feeling that her life was controlled and decided by others without her consent deepened her pain and despair, leading to a state of complete powerlessness over her fate. Her suffering was enormous. Dulcie felt sold along with her house, like an object with no control over her fate. The divorce papers came in the mail, confirming Hugo's departure and Isabelle's abandonment, but that no longer mattered to Dulcie. Only Pedro mattered. In the house where Pedro was, Elena, a neighbor, could not visit him because she was a stranger to the workers. This increased Dulcie's suffering even more, and she decided that she would not eat or drink and would simply die. This seemed a better option than continuing to live in a state of decay. Roberto, the new owner of the house, tried to help by preparing food and offering assistance, but Dulcie rejected all attempts at interaction. He tried to talk, offer food, and suggested she go outside for some fresh air. But Dulcie was determined. In one desperate moment, Dulcie asked Roberto for something impossible, to take her back in time to prevent the tragic situation she found herself in. Her shocking request reflected her state of despair and suffering. Roberto, stunned by this impossible request, fell to the ground, sobbing and suffering. He then approached Dulcie, expressing grief and sympathy, suggesting that he take her to the capital to find the best doctors, promising to help her. But something was wrong with him. His emotions seemed to be on the surface, reflecting extreme pain and suffering. Dulce was confused and scared, not understanding exactly what Roberto was going through. However, he came back to his senses, expressing his sincere desire to help Dulcie, offering financial support and resources to find medical solutions. He insisted that something could be done to help her. The young woman could barely believe Roberto's surprising gesture. He looked after her like an angel, showing such care and tenderness that Dulcie had never imagined. He lifted her gently, placed her in the wheelchair, prepared food with great care, and even took her outside for some fresh air, becoming the true guardian of her life. He also arranged visits from local beauty professionals to take care of Dulcie's appearance, knowing that a new hairstyle and well-groomed nails could lift her spirits in the midst of depression. Dulcie then asked Roberto for help in getting Pedro back, but was told that it would be better to just visit him for now, as he would soon be moving to the capital to start his rehabilitation. Elena, a neighbor, couldn't take care of Pedro during this period, so Dulcie accepted this situation temporarily. When she visited Pedro in the nursing home, the joy on the boy's face when he saw Dulcie was contagious. She promised him that she would take him to her place as soon as she was stronger and able to care for him. Pedro responded with innocent joy, saying that it would be the happiest day of his life. These moments of comfort between Dulcie and Pedro brought a little hope to the darkness that surrounded Dulcie. Roberto kept his word, taking Dulcie to the most advanced medical clinic in the region. Doctors were surprised that despite the first months of neglect and stress, there were good prospects for improvement. Dulce vowed to do everything in her power to regain her mobility, regardless of the pain she would have to endure. So, a difficult period of rehabilitation began. As the months passed, something deeper began to develop between Dulce and Roberto. Dulce realized that her feelings for him went beyond mere friendship. She realized that he was the perfect man for her, someone she had been looking for all her life. Despite this, she decided not to become a burden to him and decided to confess her feelings on one condition: she would do it when she could walk again. And finally, the day has come. Dulce, supported by crutches, took her first steps on her own. Doctors applauded her determination and independence. This success not only marked an important milestone for Dulce, but also a victory for the medical team that accompanied her through her difficult rehabilitation process. Roberto, seeing Dulce's success, had tears in his eyes. A few days later, while walking in the hospital park, Roberto helped her avoid falls. Dulce decided to fulfill her promise and confess her feelings to him. She had achieved so much, overcome so many obstacles, that she no longer felt afraid to express her love for Roberto, who always supported her and was by her side. Roberto listened carefully, holding her hand, but his face showed no clear emotion for Dulce. When she finished speaking, Roberto replied, "Dulce, thank you for your courage and honesty. I have to tell you that I love you too. I've loved you for a long time, but I have a secret you need to know. I feel terribly guilty towards you. Dulce, my car hit you that day. My wife was driving, but I helped cover up the crime. I got out of the car, I saw you weren't moving, and I thought you were already dead. We went home and I calmed down my wife, who was hysterical. It's my fault. It torments me inside. I started thinking, what if you were still alive? But then my wife's peace of mind was the most important thing to me. I later discovered that she had been cheating on me with her boss. A few weeks later, I was no longer protecting my wife, but another's lover. We divorced and I gave her almost everything, but you can't buy peace. My heart is restless. If you can, forgive me." Dulce was stunned by this revelation. She couldn't believe what she heard. Roberto's words left her in shock, trying to process the fact that the accident that paralyzed her was caused by Roberto and his wife. She looked into his eyes with a mixture of emotions, and the decision to forgive or not was in her hands. Dulce was confused by this revelation and asked for a moment alone to think about everything she had just heard. She was torn between surprise, pain, and the love she still felt for him. Roberto, respecting her wishes, left the place and gave her the space she needed. From that point on, Dulce was almost completely healed, just one small step away from being fully recovered. Sticking to the regime and regular exercise brought Pedro home from the orphanage, and the boy was happy to be home again. He quickly became friends with Roberto. Although Dulce did not speak to Roberto, he cared for her as best he could, ensuring that she had no shortage of medications and providing the best equipment for her rehabilitation. She was trying to decide if she could forgive him and move on. Text here. "Pedro, can you leave us alone? We need to have an adult conversation," Dulce said. Dulce looked at Roberto, whose heart was racing. Dulce forgave Roberto, and the two decided to build a united family and a new journey. The smiles exchanged between them indicated the seriousness of their newly formed bond. Slowly, this relationship turned into a real family. As Dulce watched the changes, she began to notice something special about herself. A wave of emotions washed over him. The soft light from the window illuminated the family room, which was both familiar and different. To his surprise, he saw his ex-wife alive and radiant, illuminated by her inner glow and with a visible pregnant belly. Dulce and Roberto, full of love, cared for Pedro, who was playing with Lego blocks. The joy was palpable in the house. But suddenly, Dulce's gaze fell on the window, and Hugo, hiding behind a tree, realized that she was no longer his wife, and this house was not his. A wave of emotions washed over him. The soft light from the window illuminated the family room, which was both familiar and different. To his surprise, he saw his ex-wife alive and radiant, illuminated by her inner glow and with a visible pregnant belly. Dulce and Roberto, full of love, cared for Pedro, who was playing with Lego blocks. The joy was palpable in the house. But suddenly, Dulce's gaze fell on the window, and Hugo, hiding behind a tree, realized that she was no longer his wife and this house was not his. With nothing left to do, he turned and left. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like on it. These other stories will probably move you too. So what do you think about this story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion really matters to me. And while you're at it, please subscribe to the channel. It would help me out a lot. But that's not all. I have something else to share with you, so click on the video that's popping up on your screen right now. I'll be waiting for you there.